What was it that made Charles Darwin Charles Darwin? Darwin was an English naturalist, geologist, and biologist, and he is famous today for his contributions to the theory of evolution. His proposition that all life on Earth descended from a common ancestor is now considered a fundamental scientific concept. Today, we're going to be talking about the life of Charles Darwin, the godfather of modern evolution. I'm Dhruv. Welcome to the Biosapientia. Darwin was the second son of society doctor Robert Waring Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood. As a young boy, Darwin stood in awe of his overbearing father, whose astute medical observations taught him much about human psychology. He hated the rote learning at the traditional Anglican Shrewsbury School, where he studied between 1818 and 1825. Science then was considered dehumanizing in English public schools, and for dabbling in chemistry, Darwin was condemned by his headmaster and nicknamed Gas by his schoolmates. His father sent him to study medicine at the Edinburgh University in 1825. Later in life, Darwin would often give the impression that he learned little to nothing during his time at Edinburgh, but in fact, the opposite was true. It was a valuable experience for him. There he learned to understand the chemistry of cooling rocks on the primitive earth and to classify plants using the modern natural system. At the Edinburgh Museum, he was taught to stuff birds by John Edmonstone, a South American slave, and also taught to identify rock strata as well as colonial flora and fauna. Most importantly, though, Edinburgh was full of radical thinkers and ideas, and the university's radical students exposed Darwin to the latest in continental sciences, which were a way of looking at science through a critical, historical, and cultural lens rather than just solely focusing on data. Though Darwin learned a lot during his time at Edinburgh, he didn't learn medicine. He hated anatomy, and the idea of surgery revolted him. His father caught on, and sensing that the church might be a better place for an aimless naturalist like Darwin, switched him to Christ's College, Cambridge in 1828. In a completely new environment, Darwin was now educated as an Anglican gentleman. He took his horse and indulged in his drinking, shooting, and beetle collecting passions along with other squires' sons. He managed 10th place in the Bachelor of Arts degree in 1831. Motivated by Alexander von Humboldt's account of the South American jungles, Darwin jumped at John Stephen Henslow's suggestion of a voyage to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. Aboard a rebuilt ship, the HMS Beagle, Darwin would sail as a self financed gentleman and a companion to the 26-year-old captain, Robert Fitzroy, an aristocrat who feared the loneliness of command. The voyage was both imperial and evangelical. They were to survey the coast of Patagonia and return three savages that had previously been brought to England from Tierra del Fuego and Christianized. Darwin equipped himself with weapons, books. Fitzroy had given him a copy of Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell and advice on how to preserve carcasses from London Zoo's experts. The Beagle departed from England on December 27, 1831. The 5 long years of physical hardship and mental rigor offset by the wide open spaces of Brazilian jungles and Andes mountains, were to give Darwin a new seriousness. Darwin could leave the ship for extended periods, pursuing his own interests, and as a result, he spent only 18 months aboard the ship. He suffered from a terrible seasickness, but it did not slow his curiosity. His plankton filled tow nets, which were nets attached to the back of the ship to collect specimens, left him wondering why such beautiful creatures teemed in the ocean's vastness where no human could appreciate them. On the Cape Verde Islands in January of 1832, Darwin observed lines of oyster shells embedded in the rocky cliffs of the coastline. This supported Charles Lyell's geological speculations that the land would rise in some places and fall in others. Darwin's trips over 2 years to the cliffs at Bahia Blanca and Port St. Julian led him to discover the huge bones of extinct mammals. Darwin manhandled skulls, femurs, and armor plates back to the ship of what he presumed were rhinoceroses, mastodons, cow sized armadillos, and giant ground sloths such as Megatherium. He also unearthed a horse sized mammal with a long face like an anteater's, and he returned from his 550-kilometer trip to Mercedes with a 70-centimeter long skull strapped to the back of his horse. Darwin's fossil discoveries raised many questions and led him to wonder about what sorts of primeval beasts roamed the ancient world and what caused them to die out. Darwin's observations confirmed that the land had been falling and rising, as Charles Lyell had suggested. After surveying the Falkland Islands and packing up the partially gnawed bones of a small rhea that he had discovered at Port Desire, Argentina, the ship sailed up the west coast of South America to Valparaiso in Chile. Here, Darwin climbed up 4,000 feet or 1,200 meters into the Andean foothills, where he marveled at the forces that could raise such mountains. He witnessed those forces himself firsthand at the eruption of the volcanic Mount Orsno on January 15th, 1835. Then again in Valdivia, Chile, on February 20th, as Darwin lay on a forest floor, the ground shook. The earthquake and ensuing tidal wave was enough to destroy the nearby city of Concepcion. As Darwin walked through the rubble, what intrigued him was seemingly insignificant. The local mussel bed, this showed that the land had risen. Charles Lyell had taken a uniformitarian position and argued that the steady forces are enough to account for all geological change. Darwin had now witnessed these forces himself firsthand, and he wondered at the eons it would take to raise fossilized trees 7,000 feet into the mountains where he had found them. This had led Darwin to start thinking in terms of deep time. They left Peru for the circumnavigation back home in September 1835. First, Darwin landed on the frying hot Galapagos Islands, which were crawling with marine iguanas and giant turtles. The crew kept small turtles aboard as pets, and contrary to legend, these islands are not where Darwin had his eureka moment. He noted that the mockingbirds differed on each of the 4 islands, and he labeled the specimens accordingly. But Darwin failed to label his other specimens of what he thought were wrens, grosbeaks, finches, and oriole relatives by island. He also failed to collect tortoise specimens, despite the fact that the locals had said that each of the islands had its own race. The homesick heroes returned via Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia. In April 1836, the ship landed at Keeling's Island in the Indian Ocean in order to see if coral reefs did in fact grow at the tops of mountains. By this time, Darwin already had his theory that coral reefs grew upwards in order to compensate for sinking land and to stay within the best heat and light conditions. At the Cape of Good Hope, Darwin talked with astronomer Sir John Herschel, possibly about Lyell's geologic evolution, and presumably about the new problem it entailed, the simultaneous change of fossil life. On the last leg of the voyage, Darwin finished up his 770-page diary, wrapped up 1,750 pages of notes, and drew up 12 catalogues for 5,436 skins, bones, and carcasses. But still, he wondered, were the different Galapagos mockingbirds a naturally produced variety? And why did giant mammals like the ground sloths go extinct? He sailed home with enough problems to last him a lifetime. When he landed in October 1836, his prospect as a vicar had faded, and he had moved on from the gun to the notebook. The supreme theorizer Darwin was now courageous enough to look beyond his own conventions in Victorian culture and look for new answers. Thank you for watching the Biosapientia. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this with anyone who you think would enjoy. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about what Darwin did in England when he returned. See you next week.